Okay, so for our next workshop, the impact of the Declaration of Chapultepec, we have as moderator Tom Julin, partnered at Hunton and Williams. He's best known as an advocate for free speech rights of both large and small clients. Early in his career, he persuaded the Florida Supreme Court to support sunshine law violations. He has defended a national television network, a local television station, and a national magazine against multi-million-dollar libel claims, and recently defended a national news reporter subpoenaed to testify a high-profile Texas criminal case. Tom is admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 1st, 2nd, and 11th circuits, and all U.S. district courts in Florida and the District of Columbia. This year, he was awarded for Best Lawyer Florida First Amendment Lawyer of the Year, 2014, and Florida Media Lawyer of the Year, 2014. As panelists, we're honored to have Alejandro Aguirre, a business and media consultant, bank director at Terramark, and board member at Leading Corporation. He's a former deputy editor of Diario Las Américas and past president of the Inter-American Press Association. Under Alejandro, the first Spanish language daily in South Florida, Diario Las Américas, became the first Spanish language paper to have a web edition. As president of the IAPA from 2009-2010, he traveled extensively on the IAPA Chapultepec program as in defense of press of freedom, and helped the launch of a Voice of Voiceless campaign, a multimedia effort by publishers and broadcast media to halt censorship and violence against journalists throughout the hemisphere. Alejandro is an active board member of businesses and cultural organizations in Miami and the region. Last but not least, Professor Leonardo Ferreira is a Worlds Ahead scholar, professor of journalism at our school. He joined FIU in 2013 after an extensive career at University of Miami. His areas of expertise are Latin American communications law, corporative media law, and journalism ethics and new technology, as well as ethnic mass media communication, and international communication policies. A published author, he continues his work as consultant for UNESCO, the Organization of American States, CIESPAL, UNICEF, IAPA, Bloomberg News, and Grupo Diarios América. So, Tim, I leave you with your panel.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I have lived in Miami for 33 years, and I note that this is the 31st of these conferences. Somehow I've missed the last 30. This is number one for me, and perhaps it speaks to one of the questions that was asked early in the day here. Why don't Americans care about all of this? Why don't American lawyers care about this? Why doesn't American media care about what's happening in Latin America? And I'd say I'm sort of your typical gringo American lawyer that doesn't pay too much attention to what is happening in Latin America. And I came for the whole day to listen to what all the speakers had to say, because I wanted to know really what I've been missing and why I haven't cared about this. And you all answered my questions. It's violent down there. Journalists are paid nothing. U.S. media doesn't care about it. There's government funding of media. There's every kind of intractable problem that you can imagine down in South America. And it's complicated. There's many countries. One after another is discussed. I don't really understand the historical differences between the countries. It's something I have a hard time getting my mind around. And I would say I am not atypical as far as media lawyers go. I've lived in Miami. I'm right here in the midst of what's happening in terms of being exposed to Spanish language media. I'm married to a woman who she's half Puerto Rican and half Cuban. You would think I would have some greater awareness, But I don't. I just don't pay too much attention to the matter. And that is, I think, a fundamental problem that I'm glad to see that you're trying to address and to get some further interaction. Now, the topic that we have to discuss today is about the Chapultepec Declaration. Who knows what that is? 1, 2, maybe 3, maybe somebody has heard of the Chapultepec Declaration before. The reason that I picked this as a topic is I had never heard of this thing. And I've been practicing in the area of media law, as I say, for 33 years and right here in the city of Miami. I didn't know what the thing was. I heard about it because I was representing a young man who had a difficult criminal problem. He was in jail. He was going to be in jail for a long time, and we were going to go to try to persuade the state attorney here to let him out early because he had been working for the Inter-American Press Association throughout most of his career before he had a terrible automobile accident that wound him up in jail. And when we were going to talk to the state attorney, one of the things we wanted to tell her about was what a wonderful young man this was and how it was deserving, he was deserving that he should be released earlier than he was scheduled to be released. And so I went to his mother and I said, tell me about this young man's career. Tell me about what he did for the Inter-American Press Association. I'd heard about the Inter-American Press Association. I knew a little bit about it. I had seen the building on Coral Way. I had been there once or twice. I thought it was maybe connected to the CIA or something like that, but I wasn't really sure too much about what this organization was about. But I was trying to help this young man, and he had worked for the IAPA. And his mother told me, well, one of the things that he was instrumental in doing was getting the Chapultepec Declaration in place. I said, really? I've never heard of the Chapultepec Declaration. She said, oh, well, let me just tell you. This was a monumental achievement. And this young man, he took this declaration, which was a declaration of the rights of journalists. It was intended to be a universal statement of the rights of journalists, and he took it with other members of the IAPA around to all of the heads of state throughout the Western Hemisphere, and he got them to sign on to it as a declaration of rights. I said, that's amazing. That's amazing that that happened. I had no idea. I spent my whole career studying First Amendment, studying American opinions, studying international law to some extent, and I had never really heard about this thing. And she said, yes, well, it was actually an amazing thing that was done. And so I did a little study of what this thing was, and I found that actually there had been a book that was published by the IAPA called Freedom of the Press and the Law that described something about how the Chapultepec Declaration came into place. And frankly, I didn't even know what Chapultepec was. I learned that there is this castle in Mexico City, I haven't been there, called the Chapultepec Castle. That's Chapultepec, I learned, means the Grasshopper's Hill. I guess some of you probably are familiar with the Chapultepec Castle and so forth. But there was this high-level meeting that was put together by one of the great press owners, Jim McClatchy, who owned McClatchy now owns the Miami Herald. And McClatchy had drafted, with others from IAPA, this statement of principles. And they did it in the Chapultepec Castle. They took 2 days. They had invited 135 leading private citizens, editors, philosopher and Nobel Prize winner Octavio Paz, law school deans, free speech lawyers, and others. They had, as the presiding officer, Javier Perez de Cuellar, former Director General of the United Nations, and they put together what they thought would be this statement of universal principles that they would then go and take and sell to every nation in South America, Latin America, and North America. And they did that, and I didn't know about that. I had no idea. It's a statement of principles that shows up nowhere in American law. There is no connection directly. I did in preparing for this discussion today, I thought, I'll see. Certainly, the United States Supreme Court must have referred to this document somewhere in all of the decisions that it has done. Nothing. Not a word. Not a word throughout all the United States court's decisions. Not a word. There's a few mentions in the U.S. congressional record, but not in the remarks actually made on the floor, but in extended remarks that certain congressmen had made about the passage of the Declaration. It's unknown in the United States. It's absolutely unknown. And I think that's a problem. Now, I have the Declaration here. It has 10 principles, and I'm not going to go through them because I want the other gentlemen here that know much more about this than I do. I don't know anything about it at all. And I'm here to learn, and I have the former president of the Inter-American Press Association. And as you all know, Professor Ferreira, I'm sure you've taught about this and know about this. I'm here to learn, what is this thing? What has it been used for? Has it done anybody any good? This is the 20th year that it has been in place. It was 20 years ago that Sergeant Pepper taught the band to play, but also that the Chapultepec Declaration was passed in March of 1994. And I think that we all need to know a little bit more about it, because obviously you've outlined all of the problems that exist in Latin America, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Paraguay. You've told me all about them. And the solution seems to be on this piece of paper that I know nothing about. So, gentlemen, tell me, what is this thing?
Tom, and I'm sure it will be a pleasure, Tom, and I'm sure Alejandro will give a far more detail, because he practically breathed the Declaration of Chapultepec, being in IAPA, like so Professor Aguirre knows this very well with the experience in the IAPA. But I can tell you that the first person you could call, Tom, to find out what the Chapultepec is the current president of the Inter-American Press Association, Elizabeth Valentine, from the Durango Herald, Durango, Colorado, which many people in Latin America will ask, where is Durango, Colorado?
I would ask.
But you will ask. So, but she said one of the advantages in the celebration of the Chapultepec Declaration that was passed on March 11, 1994, almost exactly 20 years ago. That's why in many places like here in FIU we're sitting down to discuss it. But you may not be the only one saying what is the declaration exactly. She said that the Chapultepec Declaration brought public awareness. It helped to put an abstract concept of freedom of expression in easier and concrete terms to the people so that they can understand it. It's a recent quote on the part of Mrs. Valentine, which was made after an event that I think she had in Guyana recently. By the way, it was published by the Guyana Times. But not only that, the interesting thing of the Declaration of Chapultepec is that if we want to take it back in the history, it can very easily be traced back to 1791 and the First Amendment, because many people have commented, in particular in Latin America, that the Declaration of Chapultepec, it has been heavily inspired by a First Amendment thinking, in which there is a protection of freedom of expression in the sort of the Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press, and period, with no major mentioning for the exceptions to freedom of the press. Actually, the Declaration at one point mentions no law. This is an opening statement from the Declaration. No law or act of government may limit freedom of expression or of the press, whatever the medium. And when I presented this declaration or discussed it in several events in Latin America, as I go, many people are telling me this is basically a statement similar to the First Amendment. Others say, actually, it has 10 principles, almost as if the 10 principles were the 10 commandments. Because the declaration has received great deals of friends and great deal of detractors. It's a heavily contested document, even though it has been signed by 61 presidents, and it has been accepted by nearly 30 countries in the Americas, 29, 30 countries. We have 34, if I'm not wrong. So like Edward Seaton used to say, writing a very nice article in 2003 in a publication of the IAPA, the only ones that have not signed this declaration are perhaps countries that we don't want them to sign, like Cuba and at that time Haiti, that was under military dictatorship. Actually, in 1994, it was the first summit of the Americas here in Miami, by the way. And Haiti was already into democracy, and Cuba was the only country not invited. Emilio Palacio, I don't know if he's still here, he wrote an article on the 31st of December this year saying at that time there was only one country that was not free, classified at the Freedom House. Now we have 6, and this morning we mentioned that we have 2 more after the downgrade of Ecuador and Paraguay. So when you look at the declaration, this declaration has deep roots into the history, particularly of Anglo-American tradition, Anglo-American law, and Anglo-American journalism, because it's very connected to a rooted foundation of First Amendment thinking, and on top of that, it's also very inspired in notions of ethics that became popular since the very first time we have a Pan-American meeting in 1926 in Washington, D.C., which was, for many, actually the roots, and Alejandro will correct me on this, but in the history of the IIPA, the real roots of the history of the IIPA, actually the oldest organization of that type, journalism association of the world, is the IIPA, although it came more formally being launched after World War II in the 1950s, early 1950s, correct?
Correct.
So in 1926, many people will say, actually in a very comparable meeting between American journalists, newspapermen and owners, as well as Latin American, who were coming in the beginning. 1926 is only, let's say, 12 years after the creation of Columbia University, when Joseph Pulitzer has given the money to Columbia University Graduate School to be founded. In a time when Harvard University has renounced the money of Joseph Pulitzer because he was saying that journalism was not good enough subject of studies. And the only university of prestige, let's say, that decided to take it, and not as undergraduate, but as a graduate studies, was Columbia University taking the money. So there's a whole history in which you can associate this declaration of Chapultepec with issues of the First Amendment thinking, with issues of ethics and Walter Williams that go back to the creation of the first school of journalism in Columbia, Missouri in 1908, because Walter Williams was the chairperson of that and creator of that School of Journalism, and later the president of the University of Missouri and Columbia. And we all know the reputation of Columbia, Missouri in journalism education. And if you take it then to 1994, obviously long strife, and with the push of the IAPA that finally write this declaration, invite people to write it, and it's published in 1994 with the presence of very important people, including Octavio Paz, who, by the way, Octavio Paz at that time was heavily accused, criticized, fantastic writer, who was criticized because they were saying that Octavio Paz was a pro-gringo, that he was always a pro-American. And one day he got desperate with the criticism and he said, well, what is the problem? Why don't we be honest and just become one more state in Mexico of the United States? We will be, at least in terms of freedom of expression, we will be better off. And it caused the uproar but Octavio Paz could say those things at that time. Already the Peace Award, the Nobel Award winner of literature. So if we take it, the declaration, I don't want to go too long on this, it's a declaration of significant history. It's not binding document. It's not a treaty. When you go to the Special Office of the Rapporteur of the Organization of American States, the Chapultepec Declaration is not listed as one of the binding documents, along with the Declaration of Principles of Freedom of Expression and the American Convention on Human Rights of 1969 and the Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man of 1948, passed in Bogota. But as Professor Dr. Aguirre very well said in an article, it may not be binding, but it's inserted into the Declaration of Principles of Freedom of Expression because the declaration itself recognizes that thanks to the Chapultepec Declaration, the Declaration of Principles adopted in 2000, October of 2000, of the OAS, which is a major principle today for the functioning of the Special Officer of the Rapporteur in the Organization of American States, explicitly recognized that the Declaration of Chapultepec was a significant basis for the drafting of the 13 principles that declaration, which is a binding document, has. So in other words, and Dr. Aguirre make an interesting argument that some people will criticize you as Druel for that, but I love it. You signed the French doctrine, legal doctrine, and you cite Valmayer, I don't mean, two major scholars, Carreau, French, who said that public opinion and actions of private actors, including organizations like the Inter-American Press Association and others, could produce law that would be in the end sources of law, recognized and eventually binding. If I'm not wrong, I hope I'm reading. And you make that argument that in the end, directly or indirectly, the Declaration of Chapultepec breathed as a hidden binding document for all over the continent. Others will disagree, like many presidents who have decided not to sign the declaration, saying that this is a declaration of an organization of the Inter-American Press Association representing mostly owners, and that the owners are not really, it's just a purely private document and a statement of principles, like Tom very well said, and is nothing else beyond that. And I just conclude by giving that so that Alejandro will put us more in the today and the future. I just want to conclude with a note saying it's a document that is heavily discussed, is in the air, is not that well known.
In the United States.
In the United States. Or in Latin America, I think is well known in the political realm, but I'm not sure, like you, Tom, that is really well known if we put it in the context of the civilian and ordinary organization. Though recently, Venezuela gave a very good example with students in the universities calling for the signing on the part of the students of the Chapultepec Principles, which is an interesting phenomenon considering that the students are taking such a lead in the protest in Venezuela. So it's a mixed bag, I recognize it. It's a document that definitely we need to pay attention to. It's been 20 years, and some people say, like the Inter-American Press Association would like to say, we are proud of it, certainly. We think it had made a difference. It has helped to promote very important agendas like decriminalization, access of laws, dismantling of desacato rules, and creating a culture of freedom of expression without conditions. And others will say that it's a declaration that still is not binding, it's just purely private, and it's just a document on the part of an agremiación, a guild of the Inter-American Press Association that needs, that is being over-exaggerated.
That's great. That's fascinating history. And Alejandro, you've been intimately involved with IAPA for many years. The question in my mind is has this thing done anything? Has it really worked? Has it been used, or is it, was it really a dead letter from the get-go? This was 1994. There was no internet. Times have changed. Technology has changed. Does it need to be updated? Those are some of the questions that I have in my mind. Does it still have relevance, or do we need a new Chapultepec Declaration?
Thank you very much. Tom and Professor Ferreira, I'm very honored to be here with you, and I will answer your question. First, I want to thank FIU and the University of Miami and Hunton and Williams for helping us have this dialogue today. I think this dialogue and this conversation is just as important as it relates to Latin America as it does to the United States of America, because we've had our own free press issues in the last 12 to 15 months. And besides the fact that you mentioned, Tom, that people haven't gotten too excited about some of the aspects of the Chapultepec Declaration, what has floored me the most is that a lot of people haven't gotten too excited about what the United States government and what this administration has done to journalists, even tapping the phone lines of the Associated Press. Frankly, I even find the Associated Press response a little bit muted, considering what we're talking about, and how privacy and protection of sources was something that at one time was so sacred in our country, and it seems to be just another part of the background noise. I know it's not for you. You've worked very hard in that area. Dr. Rice, Dr. Mora, I want to thank you as well for putting this on and for inviting me. My dear friend Sally, who has worked very, very hard in this area, and wonderful to see us also is Dr. Aguirre. And you know, before I start, I want to thank the translators. It's very hard work, and the people who do the AV and set these meetings up. I know it's really, really hard work, and I thank you for making the translation available to these people who don't speak one language or the other. I had the privilege of being part of the Chapultepec Declaration, and as Professor Ferreira said, it could be considered a mixed bag because it was a mixed bag. The Inter-American Press Association was the association, was the group that organized this with funding from the McCormick Foundation. But this is in fact not an IAPA document. It was a meeting that took place at Chapultepec Castle 20 years ago, at which 100 and some odd people were invited from all different ideologies and walks of life. It was the brainchild of Jim McClatchy, who thought that it was very, very important that some kind of process, in which case was the meeting, was a forum that took place in which we had members of civil society who, along with journalists, but with a very strong participation of people who were not journalists, would work, would have discussions, would have work groups, and talk about freedom of information, the free flow of information, of which freedom of the press comes from. 20 years ago, we had just come out of the end of the Cold War. There had been efforts on the part of certain NGOs, and UNESCO was one of them with the New World Information Order, to try to regulate what they felt was an imbalance of news that favored the first world over the developing world. It was a different set of circumstances that we had today, and a lot of the organizations and NGOs that were involved back then, frankly, had a very different view of what free flow of information and what and freedom of speech and freedom of the press really looked like. And this was a tremendous concern of Jim McClatchy and of members of the Inter-American Press Association. And to them, it was very, very important at the time that no governments were involved. There were some people who represented the political class. They were a couple of an ex-president, a couple of ex-members of parliaments there and things like that. But there were no governments involved, and this was by design. And during those 2 days, there were actually working groups. If I'm not mistaken, I might get the number wrong, but the reason there's 10 points to the declaration is because there were 10 working groups who were given topics, and there was about 12, 13 people per group, and they hammered out what their point was that they were going to talk about, because it's very complicated, and there was a lot of things going on at the time. And we had, as Professor Ferreira pointed out, artists, intellectuals, journalists, writers. We had just a lot of people, as I said, some of which who did not agree on a lot of the issues that were being talked about. And so literally, this was a document that was hammered out the hard way until it finally became what has become known as the Chapultepec Declaration. What there was an agreement on, and even this took a lot of work, was that the free society can work only through free expression and the exchange of the ideas. And it was very important here, the search and the dissemination of information, the ability to investigate and question, to propound and react, to agree and disagree, to converse and confront, and to publish and broadcast. I think that, in many, many ways, is what the essence of the Chapultepec Declaration was. Not just freedom of expression, freedom of press, but freedom of people to be able to go out and without consequences from a government or other forces, be able to freely look and find for information and currents and ideas without having to worry about repercussions. It was important also that we were not looking to support any ideology at the time, any political parties at the time. The only concern we had was that we were not supporting movements that were anti-democratic, because we are a democratic organization and we believe that freedom of speech and freedom of press is an integral part of the backbone of democracy, if you will. And that was the only thing we were looking at. We were not looking at whether it was a socialist or it was a right-wing conservative liberal. What was important to us is that you were committed to democracy. And the idea was to bring in a broadest of sectors, because free speech belongs to everyone. Journalists use that right, but that right belongs to all of you, belongs to all of us. We use it professionally, but it is not a right that is exclusive to us, never has been, never should be. We should be using a right that everybody has. We just have the time and the resources to dedicate our lives to this.
How that you were anticipating social media and that others would be able to really use these rights very effectively.
Actually, that was my very next point, because the Declaration says here, we know that not every statement of item of information can find its way into the media. We know that the existence of press freedom does not automatically guarantee unrestricted freedom of expression. But we also know that a free press favors an environment that nurtures freedom of expression and thereby benefits all other public freedoms. There were people there who already understood that the nature of mass media was going to change. When UNESCO was doing its New World Information Order, one of the reasons it was doing this was because only huge companies and governments, frankly, could afford the huge satellite operations, the huge communication relay organizations that allowed people to communicate with each other now. The people who, in 1994, who saw, the ideas of an internet kind of a thing, the ideas of cellular technology were still dreams, but they had a sense that this may be something incredibly empowering. They were tremendously concerned that a declaration needed to be made at that time so that we made it clear that we were expecting the same type of freedoms for any future technology as what we have now. And that point was a precursor to the new technologies. And even if you look in today's news, for example, Turkey's president rules out any ban on Facebook and YouTube after his prime minister said that the sites could be shut up to stop his foes from anonymously posting audio recordings exposing corruption, or purportedly exposing corruption in his inner circle. Turkey banned YouTube for 2 years. I have a list here, and I'm just going to show it to you. This is the first 10 websites that are banned in China. The list would go from like here to the back of the room if it was on a sheet of paper. This is totally what we were terrified of at the time, and we were terrified that governments would try to do this, and unfortunately, we were not wrong. The principles are there. I think they'd be interesting for you to take a look at them, but I would tell you that there were several follow-ups to this that had not been done before. The first one was we actually did an inventory of the press laws in Latin America. It had not been done before. It took a lot of time and it took a lot of resources. A lot of those laws have changed recently, and a new inventory needs to be done. It's a very time-consuming kind of a thing, but it's very, very important. We had forums with people of the judicial branch from the Americas. We had forums with the Supreme Court justices in Washington, as well as forums with lawmakers and the heads of parliaments in most of the countries as part of the program, to meet with the lawmakers, to have discussions about them and have them discuss it amongst themselves. We wanted to be the catalyst, but we didn't want to tell them what is essentially here in the document. We wanted to hear from them because we wanted to hold them, whatever they said, we wanted to hold them to their words. And in some cases, this has been effective because they did say some things that they didn't follow through when they got back home, either in the courts or in the parliaments, in their congresses, and we've been able to hold them to things that they said on public records. And to me, and we have, as been stated, signatories who are very well-known dignitaries, but to me the most important thing of all is that we have made in the last 20 years hundreds of presentations about Chapultepec in the universities in Latin America and in the Caribbean, and we got the students to sign on as signatories to the Chapultepec Declaration. And with all due respect to the presidents and the prime minister, to me those were the most important signatures of all, because those to me were the ones that counted, not just because they are the future and the present of our nations, but because they're the people who can put these principles into practice. They're the hope that we have that one day the Americas can be what I think is the destiny of our continent, and I'm hoping that it will come true. I may not see it, but I hope I do, to be a continent that is always young and rich and free. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I just want to add, and we'll take a couple questions, that I, as an American lawyer, I'm always making the arguments that this or that violates the First Amendment. I think I'm going to start adding, and the Chapultepec Declaration, because this needs to get into American law, too. So with that, we just have a few minutes left. If there are any questions, we will take them from you. Yes.
What countries are not signatories of the Declaration in the Americas? Because the list shows that it would not.
I know Barbados is one.
I think I can't answer the question directly, and I'll tell you why. Some of the people who signed the Declaration did not do so when they were in office, and did not want to be bound by it for legal reasons while they were there. So while, for example, I believe Bill Clinton signed the declarations, but I think it was after he was president. They like to sign these things after they're president.
It took a while for Clinton to sign
Yeah, it took a while for Clinton to sign
Convincing.
it. And obviously,
Amazingly, but it took a while.
Cuba. Yeah, and we actually had people who told us that they were going to sign it, and then when the day came to sign it, they didn't. But mostly they were countries where they had regimes. The Cuban one is the most obvious one that comes into mind, but ones where they were not prepared to follow through what free speech really means, because there was a lot of controls and a lot of discrepancies. For example, one of the issues in the 1970s and 80s was actually in Costa Rica with the Stephen Schmidt case. It was a English language newspaper writer who wrote for a weekly called the Tico Times. And Costa Rica had a law that you had to have a license to write in a newspaper. And he wrote an article in the Tico Times, and he didn't have a license, and he was put in jail. So we had a problem with Costa Rica, the Switzerland of Central America. And that was one that people didn't expect, because Costa Rica has such a strong image of being very pro-democratic, and it is, but this was just something very peculiar about their laws.
Pedro, I think that one of the reasons it's difficult to answer like that is because it's dignitaries and presidents and public figures of importance that were invited to sign. Obviously, presidents. I remember being in Guayaquil at one point, and there was a discussion with Correa, which I don't think Rafael Correa has signed it. I'm not sure. I think he has not. And at that time, they advised me in Ecuador, don't make a fuss talking so much about talking about the declaration and asking the president to sign it, which wasn't the Ecuador that it is today, which you have to be even more cautious in voicing your opinions when you're a guest. But at that time, far more open. I remember Ecuador was in the issue with a colegio, still in not willing to sign. By the way, the first president who signed was Salinas de Gortari, who was a president who later entered in disrepute, no? And he was not supposed to sign because I think that the group was not even interested in doing that. It was because someone, if I'm not wrong, the story is told by the publications and the IIPA, that someone asked President, would you sign this declaration if we put it right away in front of your table? And he said, actually, yes, I will. And then they start to say, give us the declaration. No one had it. Until one of the assistants, a judicious hard worker student probably, said, I have one here. And then that was the copy that he signed, right? And then the IIPA realized, and the group, that it was important to sign this statement of principles by different presidents. And Tom, now that you mentioned the issue of being in contradiction with the First Amendment, and it has a lot to do with Dr. Aguirre when he mentioned that in the Inter-American Court system, Venezuela was signing on condition of the state and the coherence with the national legislation. Actually, the United States did the same thing, thinking about whether or not to sign the Chapultepec Declaration, just as Clinton also took a long time in order to ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted in 1966, and the United States didn't sign it until the Clinton administration. In other words, the United States spent 30 years thinking about signing the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which had been signed already by 70-something countries. So in other words, it's not that the U.S. is a very nice easy partner, let's say, in that, in terms of signing, like it is not today with the lack of leadership, we can say, that in terms of freedom of expression, because the U.S., like Alejandro very well said, Ricardo Trotti has denounced it in several, and many organizations, CPJ, Reporters Sans Frontières, have done it, have been saying that the U.S. really is not the U.S. that was easy to present in the 1990s, like the championing. For McClatchy, it was easier to do this, champion it and funding it for Tribune Foundation than it will be today with the kind of record that the United States have about spying and issues of, especially look at the news today that I read in The Guardian. I usually read the things about the United States outside the press because we're not good about talking about ourselves. Always happens. And The Guardian says this is very unusual treatment that the Obama administration is doing of the surveillance bill that is not being discussed in the Judiciary Committee like it should be discussed, but it's going to be discussed by the Intelligence Committee. So in other words, very disturbing things that tell us that it's not easy, right, Alejandro, to promote issues and be enthusiastic like you just were, Tom, that we need to teach about the importance of the Declaration of Chapultepec and make it part of the law of the United States.
And by the way, just to follow up with what Professor Ferreira is saying, the issues of national security, and we all remember 9/11, some of you were very young when that occurred, but the issues of national security and balancing it with the freedom of the press and the people's right to know has been with us since this nation was a republic. I mean, there were issues that were discussed heavily during the two world wars. They were discussed heavily during Vietnam. The patriotism of media has been discussed amply, and I'm happy that they're discussed because I think we should not be left out of any kind of discussion or criticism that members of the civil society have. But as I said earlier, I'm I'm just worried that the general population, and I know that media have made mistakes, press has made mistakes, people don't view us in many circles very, very well. We're not very well liked, but it seems to me that in times past, there was able to be a differentiation between the right to know and the right to be informed, and the media that you liked or disliked. And now I see that they're being lumped together, and we may be tossing little by slowly a right way that is the backbone. It's one of the things that made the United States of America different, and I'm glad it's different.
Let me tell you something about, first of all, I think it's a great thing to do. There was a technical question about who signed it. First of all, the name, Chapultepec, that means a lot. It means a lot because in the history of Mexico, in the history of the Americas, that's very important. And I think that's time, the first time I read it, I think these guys are doing the right thing. And I support you because it's important. It's really important. Maybe the presidents or the politicians, they don't sign it. But as you said, the students and the people that really believe those are the signatures that are important. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I hope a few people have learned something about it. You know it exists, and I hope that you will go out there and use it. All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank
I've
you,
learned
Tom.
a lot from you, and thank you
Thank
all
you.
for coming. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, Alejandro, Leo. Tom, we will definitely invite you again next year. This is the close of this year's workshop. I want to thank all of you here and those who were here earlier today for participating. I hope, and I do think it was very thought-provoking and very informative. It certainly was for me. This is something that we're going to continue doing. We're going to continue increasing or maintaining the high level of quality of discourse, of the issues and so forth. So please stand by for more news about this workshop in the months and years to come. So on behalf of the Dean of the School of Journalism, who's not able to be here now, I want to again thank you. I want to thank all the panelists. The panelists were fantastic. Sally, thank you for supporting the panel. Very high quality, and that makes me very happy. And as I said, I'm committed to this effort. There are refreshments, there's food, actually a lot of food, and a lot of drink here in the hallway, so please eat and drink as much as you can. I'm looking at you, Tom. Thank you again. Good night.
Thank you.